Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Vital Descent. I'm your host, as always, Patrick McFarland. This one is episode 263, and the show notes may be found at vitaldescent.com/263. We got a special Halloween-themed episode for you this week. In this episode, we're going to be reading The Monkey's Paw, a short story by W. Jacobs. And you might be sitting there wondering, Patrick, how does this fit within the theme of your show? Because Vital Descent is supposed to be about dark history and geopolitics and foreign policy. What does a story like The Monkey's Paw have anything to do with that topic? Well, maybe you've read the story, maybe you haven't read the story, but we're going to be finding lots of ways in which this story relates pretty intimately with what we usually cover on this show. It's one of my favorite short stories. If you've listened to the show for a long time, I've probably let my fascination with the macabre and death metal and grotesque and morbid topics kind of leak into things a little bit here on the show proper. But The Monkey's Paw is one of my favorite all-time horror stories, and it's an incredible read. It's a relatively short one. I think it'll clock in at about 20 minutes of the playtime of this episode. Now, I don't know how many of you guys have read the short story, have listened to it, or seen one of the many adaptations of The Monkey's Paw. If you've seen Pet Sematary or read the book by Stephen King, you will have heard a version of The Monkey's Paw, a much longer, kind of different version with added things. Also, one of my favorite stories is Pet Sematary. But in it, the context of The Monkey's Paw is just very interesting, and the overall themes, and maybe I can highlight some of those themes in ways that you've never really, certain highlights of it that you've never really heard or considered before. So it does have a foreign policy element to it, and I think it does have morals or teachings, maybe unintended by the author, but things that we can glean from it and relate to modern U.S. foreign policy, wrapped up in British foreign policy. So to kind of dive into it, not to bury the lead, The Monkey's Paw is a short story by W. Jacobs. He is an author, a writer who was born in 1863 in London to a poor family. I don't believe that he ever served in the military, and of course that is relevant here as you're going to see. But his father managed a wharf in South Devon in the UK. After receiving his degree from Birkbeck College, the satirical magazines The Idler and Today published some of his stories in the early 1890s. Jacobs' first short story collection, Many Cargoes, won popular acclaim, prompting him to quit working as a clerk and begin writing full-time. So there's no mention here in this short biography on SparkNotes of any kind of military history that he had, but the time period that he was a young lad might be reflected in the story that we're going to read. He wed Angus Eleanor, a prominent suffragette, in 1900, and they had 5 children together. So it says that his initial success enabled him to escape his scrappy, hard-luck childhood and dull life as a civil servant. His earlier experiences benefited him greatly. However, he spent a lot of time hanging around the wharves in London, and many of his short stories and novels concern seamen's lives and adventures. So it's kind of a common thing of the time in British literature throughout the Imperial era, where you have a lot of people from the UK who are out in the world. I mean, there's the adage that the sun never sets on the British Empire. That's because it, exists all over the world. It's global, and there's always light on some part of it, that there were so many people in the UK who were abroad having adventures, coming back, and of course the main method of travel at that time was travel by ship, and you would get those experiences kind of seeing secondhand and swapping stories and hanging around the wharves and doing that kind of stuff. It continues, while modern readers associate Jacobs primarily with his suspenseful and frequently anthologized short story The Monkey's Paw, and to a lesser degree with his short story The Toll House, his contemporaries primarily knew him as a comic writer. Like many comic writers of the day, Jacobs explored the lives of the lower and middle classes and published many of his stories in magazines directed at this audience. The novellas at Sunwich Port, and Dialstone Lane exemplify his ability to create humorous scenarios with vivid characters. Jerome K. Jerome, a popular comic novelist of the day, was a great fan of Jacobs's and praised his strong work ethic and painstaking approach. He said that Jacobs would often rewrite just one sentence for hours at a stretch. Many luminaries of literature have praised Jacobs' work, including G.K. Chesterton, Henry James, Evelyn Waugh, and P.G. Wodehouse, and Mark Twain. So interestingly enough, there's a weird thing where, among writers themselves, where they have it in their mind that, their darlings, the works that they love the most aren't the ones that end up becoming the most popular. I've experienced that to a lesser degree, where some things, like with article writing, where some things that I don't put a whole lot of effort into and just kind of write in a one-off become, like, Pop Meets Kettle was an article that I wrote on a one-off, and it got really popular, and I think it was picked up by Zero Hedge, and I just spent a few hours writing it, and I didn't put much thought or research into it. Meanwhile, long works or complicated works that I put a lot of time into don't really get that attention per se. So it's interesting how that works, and funny how The Monkey's Paw is his most popular and popular work. So to the story itself, The Monkey's Paw, it's a horror short story. First appeared in Harper's Monthly in 1902 and was reprinted in his third collection of short stories, The Lady of the Barge, also in 1902. In the story, 3 wishes are granted to the owner of the monkey's paw, but the wishes come with an enormous price for interfering with fate. So maybe you're already picking up on some non-interventionist lessons we can be learning from this story. Of course, it's been adapted many times in other media, including plays, films, TV series, operas, stories, and comics as early as 1903. And Stephen King identifies it as being one of, identifies Pet Sematary as being a retelling of The Monkey's Paw, essentially. So, well, what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'll read it, and I'm not going to stop and comment on it. I want you to be engrossed in the story. I'll just leave up a shot of myself reading it. But it's open source, so it's not, we'll read it, and then I'll go into some of the history behind, like, Imperial Britain and Imperial Britain in India, which is happening. A lot of the things are happening in the time that W.W. Jacobs is a young kid. So we'll talk about that a little bit, and then we'll make some modern parallels, and I think it'll be a good time. All right. The Monkey's Paw. Be careful what you wish for. You may receive it. Anonymous. Part 1. Outside, the night was cold and wet, but in the small living room, the curtains were closed and the fire burned brightly. Father and son were playing chess. The father, whose ideas about the game involved some very unusual moves, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary danger that it even brought comment from the white-haired old lady knitting quietly by the fire. "Listen to the wind," said Mr. White, who, having seen a mistake that could cost him the game after it was too late, was trying to stop his son from seeing it. "I'm listening," said the son, seriously studying the board as he stretched out his hand. "Check." "I should hardly think that he'll come tonight," said his father, with his hand held in the air over the board. "Mate," replied the son. "That's the worst of living so far out," cried Mr. White with sudden and unexpected violence. "Of all the awful, out-of-the-way places to live in, this is the worst. Can't walk on the footpath without getting stuck in the mud, and the road's a river. I don't know what the people are thinking about. I suppose they think it doesn't matter because only 2 houses and the road have people in them." "Never mind, dear," said his wife calmly. "Perhaps you'll win the next one." Mr. White looked up sharply just in time to see a knowing look between mother and son. The words died away on his lips, and he hid a guilty smile in his thin gray beard. "There he is," said Herbert White, as the gate banged shut loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose quickly, and opening the door, was heard telling the new arrival how sorry he was for his recent loss. The new arrival talked about his sadness, so that Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, heavy-built, strong-looking man whose skin had the healthy reddish color associated with outdoor life and whose eyes showed that he could be a dangerous enemy. "Sergeant Major Morris," he said, introducing him to his wife and his son Herbert. The sergeant major shook hands and, taking the offered seat by the fire, watched with satisfaction as Mr. White got out whiskey and glasses. After the third glass, his eyes got brighter and he began to talk. The little family circle listened with growing interest to this visitor from distant parts as he squared his broad shoulders in the chair and spoke of wild scenes and brave acts, of wars and strange peoples. 21 years of it, said Mr. White, looking at his wife and son. When he went away, he was a thin young man. Now look at him. He doesn't look to have taken much harm, said Mrs. White politely. I'd like to go to India myself, said the old man, just to look around a bit, you know. Better where you are, said the sergeant major, shaking his head. He put down the empty glass and, sighing softly, shook it again. I should like to see those temples, those old temples and fakirs and the street entertainers, said the old man. What was that you started telling me the other day about a monkey's paw or something, Morris? Nothing, said the soldier quickly, at least nothing worth hearing. Monkey's paw, said Mrs. White curiously. Well, it's just a bit of what you might call magic, perhaps, said the sergeant major without first stopping to think. His three listeners leaned forward excitedly. Deep in thought, the visitor put his empty glass to his lips and then set it down again. Mr. White filled it for him again. To look at it, said the sergeant major, feeling about in his pocket. It's just an ordinary little paw, dried to a mummy. He took something out of his pocket and held it out for them. Mrs. White drew back with a look of disgust, but her son, taking it, examined it curiously. And what is there special about it? Asked Mr. White as he took it from his son, and having examined it, placed it upon the table. It had a spell put on it by an old fakir, said the sergeant major, a very holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives and that those who tried to change it would be sorry. He put a spell on it so that 3 different men could each have 3 wishes from it. The way he told the story showed that he truly believed it, and his listeners became aware that their light laughter was out of place and had hurt him a little. Well, why don't you have 3, sir? Said Herbert cleverly. The soldier looked at him the way that the middle-aged usually looked at disrespectful youth. I have, he said quietly, and his face whitened. And did you really have the 3 wishes granted? Asked Mrs. White. I did, said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. And has anybody else wished? Continued the old lady. The first man had his 3 wishes, yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw. His voice was so serious that the group fell quiet. If you've had your 3 wishes, it's no good to you now then, Morris, said the old man at last. What do you keep it for? The soldier shook his head. Fancy, I suppose, he said slowly. I did have some idea of selling it, but I don't think I will. It has caused for me enough trouble already. Besides, people won't buy. They think it's just a story, some of them, and those who do think anything of it want to try it first and pay me afterward. If you could have another 3 wishes, said the old man, watching him carefully, would you have them? I don't know, said the other. I don't know. He took the paw and, holding it between his front finger and thumb, suddenly threw it upon the fire. Mr. White, with a slight cry, quickly bent down and took it off. Better let it burn, said the soldier sadly, but in a way that let them know he believed it to be true. If you don't want it, Morris, said the other, then give it to me. I won't, said his friend with stubborn determination. I threw it on the fire. If you keep it, don't hold me responsible for what happens. Throw it on the fire like a sensible man. The other shook his head and examined his possession closely. How do you do it? He asked. Hold it up in your right hand and state your wish out loud so that you can be heard, said the sergeant major, but I warn you of what might happen. Sounds like the Arabian Nights, said Mrs. White as she rose and began to set the dinner. Don't you think you might wish for 4 pairs of hands for me? Her husband drew the talisman from his pocket, and all 3 laughed loudly as the sergeant major, with a look of alarm on his face, caught him by the arm. If you must wish, he demanded, wish for something sensible. Mr. White dropped it back in his pocket, and placing chairs, motioned his friend to the table. In the business of dinner, the talisman was partly forgotten, and afterward the three sat fascinated as they listened to more of the soldier's adventures in India. "If the tale about the monkey's paw is not more truthful than those he has been telling us," said Herbert, as the door closed behind their guest, just in time to catch the last train, "we shan't make much out of it." "Did you give anything for it, father?" asked Mrs. White, watching her husband closely. "A little," said he, coloring slightly. "He didn't want it, but I made him take it, and he pressed me again to throw it away." "Not likely," said Herbert, with pretended horror. "Why, we're going to be rich and famous and happy," smiling, he said, "wishing to be a king, father, to begin with, then mother can't complain all the time." He ran quickly around the table, chased by the laughing Mrs. White, armed with a piece of cloth. Mr. White took the paw from his pocket and eyed it doubtfully. "I don't know what to wish for, and that's a fact," he said slowly. "It seems to me I've got all I want." "If you only paid off the house, you'd be quite happy, wouldn't you?" said Herbert, with his hand on his shoulder. "Well, wish for 200 pounds then. That'll just do it." His father, smiling and with an embarrassed look for his foolishness in believing the soldier's story, held up the talisman. Herbert, with a serious face, spoiled only by a quick smile to his mother, sat down at the piano and struck a few grand chords. "I wish for 200 pounds, said the old man clearly. A fine crash from the piano greeted his words, broken by a frightened cry from the old man. His wife and son ran toward him. "It moved," he cried, with a look of horror at the object as it lay on the floor. "As I wished, it twisted in my hand like a snake." "Well, I don't see the money," said his son, as he picked it up and placed it on the table, "and I bet I never shall." It must have been your imagination, father," said his wife, regarding him worriedly. He shook his head. "Never mind, though, there's no harm done, but it gave me a shock all the same." They sat down by the fire again while the two men finished their pipes. Outside, the wind was higher than ever, and the old man jumped nervously at the sound of a door banging upstairs. An unusual and depressing silence settled on all three, which lasted until the old couple got up to go to bed. "I expect you'll find the cash tied up in a big bag in the middle of your bed," said Herbert as he wished them good night, "and something horrible sitting on top of your wardrobe watching you as you pocket your ill-gotten money." Herbert, who normally had a playful nature and didn't like to take things too seriously, sat alone in the darkness looking into the dying fire. He saw faces in it, the last so horrible and so monkey-like, that he stared at it in amazement. It became so clear that with a nervous laugh, he felt on the table for a glass containing some water to throw over it. His hand found the monkey's paw, and with a little shake of his body, he wiped his hand on his coat and went up to bed. Part 2. In the brightness of the wintry sun next morning, as it streamed over the breakfast table, he laughed at his fears. The room felt as it always had, and there was an air of health and happiness, which was not there the previous night. The dirty, dried-up little paw was thrown on the cabinet with a carelessness which indicated no great belief in what good it could do. "I suppose all soldiers are the same," said Mrs. White. "The idea of our listening to such nonsense. How could wishes be granted in these days? And if they could, how could 200 pounds hurt you, father?" "Might drop on his head from the sky," said Herbert. "Morris said the things happen so naturally," said his father, "that you might, if you so wished, not see the relationship." "Well, don't break into the money before I come back," said Herbert as he rose from the table to go to work. "I'm afraid it'll turn you into a mean, greedy old man, and we shall have to tell everyone that we don't know you." His mother laughed, and following him to the door, watched him go down the road, and returning to the breakfast table, she felt very happy at the expense of her husband's readiness to believe such stories. All of which did not prevent her from hurrying to the door at the postman's knock, nor when she found that the post brought only a bill, talking about how sergeant majors can develop bad drinking habits after they leave the army. "Herbert will have some more of his funny remarks, I expect, when he comes home," she said as they sat at dinner. "I know," said Mr. White, pouring himself out some beer, "but for all that, the thing moved in my hand, and I'll swear to. That I'll swear to." "You thought it did," said the old lady, trying to calm him. "I say it did," replied the other. "There was no thought about it. I had just— What's the matter?" His wife made no reply. She was watching the mysterious movements of a man outside, who, looking in an undecided fashion at the house, appeared to be trying to make up his mind to enter. In mental connection with the 200 pounds, she noticed that the stranger was well dressed and wore a silk hat of shiny newness. 3 times he stopped briefly at the gate and then walked on again. The 4th time he stood with his hand upon it, and then with sudden firmness of mind pushed it open and walked up the path. Mrs. White, at the same moment, placed her hands behind her, hurriedly untied the strings of her apron and put it under the cushion of her chair. She brought the stranger, who seemed a little uncomfortable, into the room. He looked at her in a way that said there was something about his purpose that he wanted to keep secret, and seemed to be thinking of something else as the old lady said she was sorry for the appearance of the room and her husband's coat, which he usually wore in the garden. She then waited as patiently as her sex would permit for him to state his business, but he was at first strangely silent. I was asked to call," he said at last, and bent down and picked up a piece of cotton from his trousers. "I come from Ma and Megan's." The old lady jumped suddenly as in alarm. "Is anything the matter?" she asked breathlessly. "Has anything happened to Herbert? What is it? What is it?" Her husband spoke before he could answer. There, mother," he said hurriedly. "Sit down and don't jump to a conclusion. You've not brought bad news, I'm sure, sir," and eyed the other, expecting that it was bad news, but hoping he was wrong. "I'm sorry," began the visitor. "Is he hurt?" demanded the mother wildly. The visitor lowered and raised his head once in agreement. "Badly hurt," he said quietly, "but he is not in any pain." "Oh, thank God," said the old woman, pressing her hands together tightly. "Thank God for that. She broke off, as the tragic meaning of the part about him not being in pain came to her. The man had turned his head slightly, so as not to look directly at her, but she saw the awful truth in his face. She caught her breath, and turning to her husband, who did not yet understand the man's meaning, laid her shaking hand on his. There was a long silence. He was caught in the machinery," said the visitor at length in a low voice. "Caught in the machinery," repeated Mr. White, too shocked to think clearly. "Yes." He sat staring out the window and, taking his wife's hand between his own, pressed it, as he used to do when he was trying to win her love in the time before they were married, nearly 40 years before. "He was the only one left to us," he said, turning gently to the visitor. "It is hard." The other coughed, and rising, walked slowly to the window. "The firm wishes me to pass on their great sadness about your loss," he said, without looking around. I ask that you to please understand that I am only their servant and simply doing what they told me to do." There was no reply. The old woman's face was white, her eyes staring, and her breath unheard. On the husband's face was a look such as his friend the sergeant major might have carried into his first battle. "I was to say that Ma and Megan's accept no responsibility," continued the other, "but although they don't believe that they have a legal requirement to make a payment to you for your loss, in view of your son's services, they wish to present you with a certain sum." Mr. White dropped his wife's hand, and rising to his feet stared with a look of horror at his visitor. His dry lips shaped the words, "How much?" £200 was the answer. Without hearing his wife scream, the old man smiled weakly, put out his hands like a blind man, and fell, a senseless mass, to the floor. Part 3. In the huge new cemetery some 2 miles away, the old people buried their dead, and came back to the house, which was now full of shadows and silence. It was all over so quickly that at first they could hardly realize it, and remained in a state of waiting for something else to happen, something else which was to lighten this load, too heavy for old hearts to bear. But the days passed, and they realized that they had to accept the situation, the hopeless acceptance of the old. Sometimes they hardly said a word to each other, for now they had nothing to talk about, and their days were long to tiredness. It was about a week after that, the old man, waking suddenly in the night, stretched out his hand and found himself alone. The room was in darkness, and he could hear the sound of his wife crying quietly at the window. He raised himself in bed and listened. "Come back," he said tenderly. "You will be cold." "It's colder for my son," said the old woman, who began crying again. The sounds of crying died away on his ears. The bed was warm, and his eyes heavy with sleep. He slept lightly at first, and then was fully asleep until a sudden wild cry from his wife woke him with a start. "The paw!" she cried wildly. "The monkey's paw!" He stared up in alarm. Where is it? What's the matter?" She almost fell as she came hurried across the room toward him. "I want it," she said quietly. "You've not destroyed it." "It's in the living room on the shelf above the fireplace," he replied. "Why?" She cried and laughed together, and bending over kissed his cheek. "I only just thought of it," she said. "Why didn't I think of it before? Why didn't you think of it?" "Think of what?" he questioned. "The other 2 wishes," she replied quickly. "We've only had one." "Was not that enough?" he demanded angrily. "No," she cried excitedly. "We'll have one more. Go down and get it quickly and wish our boy alive again." The man sat up in bed and threw the blankets from his shaking legs. "Good God, are you mad?" he cried, struck with horror. "Get it," she said, breathing quickly. "Get it quickly and wish. Oh, my boy, my boy." Her husband struck a match and lit the candle. "Get back to bed," he said, his voice shaking. "You don't know what you're saying." "We had the first wish granted," said the old woman desperately. "Why not the second?" A coincidence," said the old man. "Go get it and wish," cried his wife, shaking with excitement. The old man turned and looked at her, and his voice shook. "He's been dead 10 days, and besides, I would not tell you before, but I could only recognize him by his clothing. If he was too terrible for you to see then, how now?" "Bring him back," cried the old woman, and pulled him towards the door. "Do you think I fear the child that I've nursed?" He went down in the darkness and felt his way to the living room and then to the fireplace. The talisman was in its place on the shelf, and then a horrible fear came over him that the unspoken wish might bring the broken body of his son before him before he could escape from the room. He caught his breath as he found that he had lost the direction of the door. His forehead cold with sweat, he felt his way round the table and along the walls until he found himself at the bottom of the stairs with the evil thing in his hand. Even his wife's face seemed changed as he entered the room. It was white and expectant, and to his fears seemed to have an unnatural look about it. He was afraid of her. "Wish!" she cried in a strong voice. "It is foolish and wicked," he said weakly. "Wish!" repeated his wife. He raised his hand. "I wish my son alive again." The talisman fell to the floor, and he looked at it fearfully. Then he sank into a chair, and the old woman, with burning eyes, walked to the window and opened the curtains. He sat until he could no longer bear the cold, looking up from time to time at the figure of his wife staring through the window. The candle, which had almost burned out to the bottom, was throwing moving shadows around the room. When the candle finally went out, the old man, with an unspeakable sense of relief at the failure of the talisman, went slowly back to his bed, and a minute afterward the old woman came silently and lay without movement beside him. Neither spoke, but lay silently listening to the ticking of the clock. Tick, tick, tick. They heard nothing else other than the normal night sounds. The darkness was depressing, and after lying for some time, building up his courage, the husband took the box of matches, and lighting one, went downstairs for another candle. At the foot of the stairs, the match went out, and he stopped to light another, and at the same moment a knock sounded on the front door. It was so quiet that it could only be heard downstairs, as if the one knocking wanted to keep their coming a secret. The matches fell from his hand. He stood motionless, not even breathing, until the knock was repeated. Then he turned and ran quickly back to his room and closed the door behind him. A third knock sounded throughout the house. "What's that?" cried the old woman, sitting up quickly. "A rat," said the old man shakily. "A rat. It passed me on the stairs." His wife sat up in bed, listening. A loud knock echoed through the house. "It's Herbert!" she screamed. "It's Herbert!" She ran to the door, but her husband was there before her, and catching her by the arm, held her tightly. "What are you going to do?" he asked in a low, scared voice. "It's my boy, it's Herbert," she cried, struggling automatically. "I forgot it was 2 miles away. What are you holding me for? Let go. I must open the door." "For God's sake, don't let him in," cried the old man, shaking with fear. "You're afraid of your own son," she cried, struggling. "Let me go. I'm coming. Herbert, I'm coming." There was another knock and another. The old woman with a sudden pull broke free and ran from the room. Her husband followed to the top of the stairs and called after her as she hurried down. He heard the chain pulled back and the bottom lock open. Then the old woman's voice, desperate and breathing heavily. "The top lock," she cried loudly. "Come down, I can't reach it." But her husband was on his hands and knees, feeling around wildly on the floor in search of the paw. If only he could find it before the thing outside got in. The knocks came very quickly now, echoing throughout the house, and he heard the noise of his wife moving a chair and putting it down against the door. He heard the movement of the lock as she began to open it, and at the same time, he found the monkey's paw and frantically breathed his third and last wish. The knocking stopped suddenly, although the echoes of it were still in the house. He heard the chair pulled back and the door opened. A cold wind blew up the staircase, and a long, loud cry of disappointment and pain from his wife gave him the courage to run down to her side, and then to the gate. The streetlight opposite shone on a quiet and deserted road. And that's the end of The Monkey's Paw. So I don't know, maybe the first time that you guys heard The Monkey's Paw or read it was in high school. I think that's the first time that I remember reading it. And as things tend to do when you're in high school, sometimes you don't really see the coolness or, the interest, the intrigue in something that you're forced to read. Gotta wet my throat there. I think there's so many themes here that we could pick at that are unique to foreign policy or talking about war or killing in war, things that I've discussed numerous times on my podcast that we've covered here. I think one interesting aspect of it is the naive complacency or I don't know exactly how to say this feeling that how the old folks treat Sergeant Major Morris and the kind of bemusement they have with him, that even though the story refers to him having seen things and him looking at this old couple the way that the old look at stupid naive young people with this kind of knowingness and I don't want to really say contempt, but maybe it's the way that if you have kids and you're not with your kids, or you're older and you have had kids and you walk through the grocery store and you see other people with their kids who are throwing fits and you look at them with this look like, I know what you're going through. But old people, I mean, I don't do this, but old people, they tend to irritate me because they'll pass you by in the grocery store and they look at you like it's funny to them. I hate that. I don't know. It happened to me yesterday. Maybe that's not quite the look that that Sergeant Major Morris is giving these old people. In a way, maybe it is, because he doesn't get any respect for the things that he's seen and done and experienced, and he's trying to tell these old people who have never done, they probably have never left England. They've never, I don't think Mr. White has ever seen combat or anything like that. And I think it's interesting. And here's the parallel with kind of the modern world is that, you get veterans coming back from the terror wars and they're kind of disenfranchised, but also they're not enchanted with all of the promises and the reasons for going to war that were sold or heralded back in the day. And as all of us have back home have forgotten about the war and have kind of moved on, in a sense, a 20-year long war, and gotten on with our lives, the realness and the horrors and all that kind of things that the veterans have gone and have experienced and become wise beyond their years in our stead, coming back trying to tell us things about it. And of course, veterans aren't a monolith. Different people have different opinions, different experiences. and serving has taught them different things. But in this sense, it's just very bold that Sergeant Major Morris has gone and experienced and killed and fought in battles and has partaken in the culture, Indian culture, in a way that it's no joke. It's not a parlor story for the amusement of these old people. And in parts, I even wonder why Sergeant Major Morris is even amusing Mr. White and his family, because it seems like Mr. White has known Sergeant Major Morris for 22 years, 21, 22 years. And I think what had happened is that Mr. White worked with Sergeant Major Morris before Mr. Morris left joined the military and left to go abroad. And when he left, I'm sure he was, I don't know, maybe he was 17 or 18 or something like that, experienced all these things, grew up into a man, and is now coming back and calling on the people that he knew before he left 20 years ago. And they're just bemused with these real stories and experiences that he's had. And it's not just about the monkey's paw. It's also about his experiences over there. So if you get to this part, Mrs. White is being polite, says, he doesn't look to have taken much harm, which by the description of W.W. Jacobs doesn't sound like it's quite the case, that you can see his weathering on his face. But Mr. White says, "I'd like to go to India myself," said the old man, just to look around a bit, like as if, he's like, well, I'd like to go to, I don't know, Duluth myself and look around the shops and do this kind of stuff, not, travel across the world to this untamed, in quotes, this untamed land fraught with violence and as an old man, probably in his 60s or 70s, as if it's no big deal. And Sergeant Major says, "Better where you are." And then he continues and presses it and says, "I should like to see those old temples and fakirs and the street entertainers," said the old man. "And what was that silly story you were telling me about the monkey's paw or something?" And the soldier says, "Nothing, nothing worth hearing." And then they press him on it. And of course, I don't know, it alludes to the fact that Sergeant Major Morris was the second person to possess the monkey's paw. And if you caught it at the beginning of the story, there's a short little line about how Sergeant Major Morris is over and Mr. White greets him in the entryway and expresses his sympathy for Mr. Morris's recent loss. Let's see. "There he is," says Herbert White, as the gate banged shut loudly and heavy footsteps came toward the door. The old man rose quickly and, opening the door, was heard telling the new arrival how sorry he was for his recent loss. So what is that recent loss? The new arrival talked about his sadness, so that Mrs. White said, "Tut, tut," and coughed gently as her husband entered the room, followed by a tall, heavy-built, strong-looking man whose skin had the healthy, reddish color associated with outdoor life, and whose eyes showed that he could be a dangerous enemy. So I suppose maybe she is telling the truth when she says, well, he doesn't look to have taken much harm. Sounds like he's kind of in the prime of his life, but he's troubled and he's saddened, like he's been through something. And it's almost like the monkey's paw story could be an allegory for, I don't know, as we're like a non-interventionist, podcast show here, like it's an allegory for the truth of battle or the truth of warfare, that someone who's seen it and who has experienced tries to tell someone who hasn't what it's really like, and those people don't believe him. It's not a perfect kind of like allegory. But he tries to tell them the truth about what it is, but they just discard it and say it's either it's naivete or it's just claptrap that you're imagining yourself. And it's pretty, disrespectful. he says, it had a spell put on it by an old fakir, a holy man. He wanted to show that fate ruled people's lives, and those who tried to change it would be sorry. He put a spell on it so that 3 different men could each have 3 wishes from it. And this is something, of course, you see in folklore and fairy tales and supernatural kind of pieces of media, is that the repetition of numbers, the foreshadowing and the repetition of numbers that are magical, like three wishes. I don't know, like those kind of things. Trying to think of other stories that have those, the 3 blind mice, the 3 billy goats gruff, all those things that you hear coming up over and over again in different stories like this. But there is a weight to it. It builds this kind of energy and momentum with it. The soldier looked at him. Well, why don't you have 3, sir? Said Herbert cleverly, like just making a joke out of this to the sergeant major. The soldier looked at him the way that the middle-aged usually look at disrespectful youth. I have, he said quietly, and his face whitened. And did you really have the 3 wishes granted? Asked Mrs. White. I did, said the sergeant major, and his glass tapped against his strong teeth. And has anyone else wished? Continued the old lady. The first man had 3 wishes, yes, was the reply. I don't know what the first 2 were, but the third was for death. That's how I got the paw. So the old man and his wife are the 3rd wishers. So there's another thing here. I think in the beginning, even earlier, where they're playing the game of chess, and it looks like Mr. White. Even in the first paragraph, they set this tone, kind of like a lesson. Father and son were playing chess. The father, whose ideas about the game involved some very unusual moves, putting his king into such sharp and unnecessary danger that it even brought comment from the white-haired old lady knitting quietly by the fire. Listen to the wind, said Mr. White, who, having seen a mistake that could cost him the game after it was too late, was trying to stop his son from seeing it. So I mean, of course, the one thing that I think of is U.S. foreign policy in regards to Russia and China, the brinksmanship, and putting the king into such sharp and unnecessary danger that it even brought comment from the white-haired old lady knitting quietly by the fire. I mean, the quest for world dominance in terms of brinksmanship and pushing and saying, oh, well, Putin hasn't used nuclear weapons yet, so we can keep pushing, essentially. And there's also kind of the theme of colonialism itself, and I'm not going to, turn into social justice something about it, but the colonial history of Britain in India. So I'm not an expert on this part of British history as it pertains to India itself, but I got this snapshot from an online course about British imperial history in India. So you can see here on the screen, Western held territories in Asia, 1910. So this is 8 years after W. Jacobs writes The Monkey's Paw, that the British, Great Britain, owns a large part of India, parts of Afghanistan, Pakistan, India, and then into Burma as well. Parts of Mali, or Malay, the Malay states. I think Mali's in the Mediterranean. And so you have the British Raj, the East India Company first dominating parts of India until the beginning of the 19th century. The company ruled India with little interference from the British government. The company even had its own army led by British officers and staffed by sepoys, Sepoys, or Indian soldiers. The governor of Bombay, Mount Stuart Elphinstone, referred to the sepoy army as, quote, a delicate and dangerous machine which A little mismanagement may easily turn against us. So going forward, there was a rebellion, a large rebellion in 1857. So the Sepoy Mutiny. By 1850, the British controlled most of the Indian subcontinent. However, there were many pockets of discontent. Many Indians believed that in addition to controlling their land, the British were trying to convert them to Christianity. The Indian people also resented the constant racism that the British expressed toward them. Indians rebel. As economic problems increased for Indians, so did their feelings of resentment and nationalism. In 1857, gossip spread among the Sepoys, the Indian soldiers, that the cartridges of their new Enfield rifles were greased with beef and pork fat. To use the cartridges, soldiers had to bite off the ends. Both Hindus, who consider the cow sacred, and Muslims, who do not eat pork, were outraged by the news. A garrison commander was shocked when 85 of the 90 Sepoys refused to accept the cartridges. The British handled the crisis badly. The soldiers who had disobeyed were jailed. The next day, on May 10th, 1857, they rebelled. They marched to Delhi, where they were joined by Indian soldiers stationed there. They captured the city of Delhi. From Delhi, the rebellion spread to northern and central India. But then there was a turning point in 1858. The mutiny sparked a turning point in Indian history. As a result of the mutiny, in 1858, the British government took direct command of India. The part of India that was under direct British rule was called the Raj. The term Raj referred to British rule in India, over India, from 1757 until 1947. A cabinet minister in London directed policy, and a British governor-general in India carried out the government's orders. After 1877, this official held the title of viceroy. So you get a number of wars fought between Britain and India throughout the late 1800s. And I'm wondering, if W.W. Jacobs, growing up during that time, I'm sure had run into people who, soldiers who were returning from those conflicts. He was born in 1863. And if he was spending a lot of time around wharfs, I'm sure that the soldier from his story was based off of someone that he knew, or some conversations he had or something like that. So here's another analysis, a short analysis. This is Interesting Literature website, interestingliterature.com, a short analysis of W.W. Jacobs' The Monkey's Paw. Now it's time to offer some words of analysis and commentary on The Monkey's Paw. It's a modern fairy tale, and indeed fairy tales and magical stories from the Arabian Nights are both mentioned by characters in the story. As in many classic fairy tales, the number 3 is invested with great narrative significance. There are 3 members of the White family. 3 men can use the monkey's paw to request wishes, and each man gets 3 wishes. There are 3 knocks at the door after the Whites use the monkey's paw to wish for their son to be alive again, and the man who comes to inform the Whites of their son's death, he crosses in front of the house 3 times. The story itself is divided into 3 parts. The Monkey's Paw was first published in Harper's Monthly. We already talked about that. The moral of this story is, be careful what you wish for. The White family choose to use the monkey's paw to wish for 200 pounds, not an insubstantial sum in 1902, thus opening themselves up to the charge of personal greed, especially as the money is wanted for nothing more life-threatening than clearing up the house. I mean, I don't necessarily think that they're greedy. They're a very... Seems like they're a very humble family. They have a humble house out in the countryside. It seems like he's been a laborer for most of his life. They've lost their children, and they only have 1 child left. And I don't think that his wish was made out of greed. I mean, if you think of what most people would wish for if they had 3 wishes, the first would probably be for money. And it's not a large amount of money that he wishes for. It's a very modest sum in terms of, I mean, you're talking about enough money to pay off the mortgage, essentially, which isn't really, I mean, he could have wished for millions of pounds or to be king of the world, like his son says. So I don't think they're necessarily greedy. I think they're just naive, and their folly isn't greed, I don't think. I mean, to disagree with this analysis, it's not greed. I think it's, in a sense, naivete, but headstrong naivete, and being, I don't know, their bemusement at the soldier and the seriousness of certain things, like to their naivete in being little Englanders in the sense that they've never left, they're not worldly, and everything that is happening in the world is, I mean, much like the American people, right? They're kind of ignorant and amused in their own kind of ignorant way with the ways of the world and the reality of certain situations, and being disconnected from them because of that separation, but not taking it seriously. At the same time, the family do not seem to be especially rich. Okay, so maybe this piece, reading from it again, is not completely off base. So it doesn't strike us as an overly grasping and greedy act, but their punishment is to come into possession of the 200 pounds in the most horrible way possible as compensation for the loss of their son. What makes The Monkey's Paw so unsettling and such a masterclass in writing horror fiction is that Jacobs doesn't give us a clear reason why Mr. White should deserve such a fate. If The Monkey's Paw represents the Empire striking back, we are given no indication that White or his family is or has been particularly heavily involved in colonial India, and thus one might argue fair game. So, I don't know, in some ways you could relate this to September 11th. Like, the people who died in the towers, they didn't deserve that. They didn't deserve to be killed because of blowback from U.S. foreign policy. And I think essentially that's what The Monkey's Paw maybe signifies. And this article is going to argue here in a minute that basically The Monkey's Paw is blowback. It's revenge from the natives for meddling in their affairs. Revenge against the imperial powers, but revenge against the ignorant people who facilitate it essentially through their apathy. At the same time, it's worth remembering that the surname of the Englishman who acquires the monkey's paw is White. He is the white Englishman in possession of a magical Indian object which embodies the colonial other, the empire striking back. Perhaps being British is enough, but perhaps this is to look for motivation for something which requires none. It is a monkey's paw, after all, an inanimate, albeit once animate object, and it is pure coincidence that it finds its way into Mr. White's possession. So I don't know, maybe W.W. Jacobs, he married a famous suffragette, so maybe he was progressive at the time, but I think, I don't know if, it seems like everything he did in this story was pointed, like it had a purpose, and maybe he did mean some kind of message with naming the character White. Who knows? But I wouldn't think that he would have done that in necessarily a racially charged 2023, lesbian English professor would read into it from a Big Ten university or something like that. So if Mr. White had been an army veteran like Morris who had served in India, or if he had made a fortune through colonial ventures, maybe it would have reduced the story to a morality tale about the evils of empire, but it doesn't. It makes less sense, which makes you ponder and makes it scarier because it's not, like what this article is saying. I mean, in the way that 9/11 was terrifying to a lot of people because the victims weren't directly involved in, or the American people weren't directly involved in the exploits of the empire. So, furthermore, in 1902, the British Empire still wasn't problematic for many Britons. What makes the story more unsettling is a strong suspicion that Mr. White doesn't deserve his fate, and that his son definitely doesn't deserve to die, so the terms of the first wish can be fulfilled. I think that Mr. White, and he doesn't deserve his fate, but at the same time, there's his lack of respect for Mr. Morris is the cause, I think, of his fate. So stories about the revenge of the Empire were popular around the turn of the century, as novels like Richard Marsh's The Beetle and Arthur Conan Doyle's short stories attest. But what makes The Monkey's Paw such a preeminent example of the supernatural tale and such a popular story is that its themes are not reducible to empire. Its moral, be careful what you wish for, is, in the last analysis, a little clever and more complex than this. Even the most innocent ambitions or wishes may have unintended consequences. So the other thought I guess I could pull from this, even though I don't know, I think the article makes like a decent point that it's a bit more complex than like the revenge of the Empire. There is this whole other side to it that might be a little more practical and straightforward, like be careful what you wish for and don't mess with the power of fate, in a way. And I think that's even more relatable to interventionism itself. Like this UN invasion of Haiti, essentially, is that they're going to be deploying Kenyan soldiers to Haiti to quell civil unrest in there caused by basically the tumult left in the wake of the assassination of the Haitian president Jovenel Moïse. And Ariel Henry kind of being the Western kind of puppet that's been installed. And when Haiti's unrest in history, just as an example, has been facilitated and caused by U.S. primarily interventionism in that country for hundreds of years. We covered that on this podcast here in an interview with Scott Spalding. I don't remember exactly when that was. But fate playing out the way that fate will play out. In this story, Mr. White tries to mess with fate by using the monkey's paw to change the way that his life would have gone had he not messed with it, right? And that being his son, the only son that he has left, living with them, continuing to live with them, and being a happy family for a while until he dies of natural causes, ostensibly, right? But instead, there's an outside force that comes and he attempts to change the sequence of events in his life, kind of like Back to the Future in a sense. Whereas this would be continuing that theme of be careful what you wish for, neoconservatives and interventionists getting involved in trying to engineer events to take place through color revolutions or military interventions or sanctions and all the trappings that go along with that, and essentially creating a worse result than what would have happened had you just left it be and let things pan out the way that they were supposed to pan out. So I won't belabor that point. I really hope that you enjoyed The Monkey's Paw. It's one of my favorite stories ever. So if you did enjoy it, and if you enjoyed my retelling of it, go ahead, subscribe, like, rate, review, Apple, vitaldescent.com/iTunes, leave a review there. All the platforms that you're doing this on. Head on over to the Libertarian Institute, because I am the Justin Raimondo Fellow at the Libertarian Institute. All my content goes up there. We have a lot of really awesome stuff cooking, books coming out. Keith Knight just killing it, talking to people like Cenk from the Young Turks, doing a long interview with him. So much stuff going on, guys. So libertarianinstitute.org, vitaldescent.com. If you want to help support my work, head on over to libertyweekly.club. Sign up for my email list for free. There's also a paid option. But if you want bonuses like early access to content, behind the scenes of my work on Oppenheimer Part 2, which I am working on, and all that good stuff, bonus episodes, all that stuff, libertyweekly.club. And you can sign up there, $5 a month or $55 a year. Really do appreciate that. And we'll catch you next time. Peace.